Hello everyone, I'm here again with Christine, and today we are covering OCD in the workplace. Is there anything you'd like to say? Beans!
First of all, thank you for having me back. Rowan, before we start, everyone talks about OCD as being OCD. Everyone's familiar with the term, but OCD is an anxiety disorder. And OCD also has a number of subcategories, which I know you've covered in one of your earlier videos. Are there some subcategories that you want to kind of identify or just mention today?
Yes. OCD does present in many different ways. It's different for everybody. Some people may have obsessions around contamination. They may worry about touching other people's things. They may wash their hands a lot. They may not share cutlery, not allow other people to prepare their food. Some people may have, just hit myself in the nose, may have obsessions with, like, similar to perfectionism, like feeling the need to line things up, and they literally spend hours lining things up. It's not just like, oh, this irritates me, they'll move it. It's hours of lining things up. It's very excessive. Beans, some people will have rituals and obsessions regarding morals, so people might always worry about doing the wrong thing. Some people may have difficulty making decisions and may sort of ruminate and obsess about every single decision. And beans, there are a lot of categories of OCD. There is also Tourettic OCD, beans, which isn't anxiety related, but most forms of OCD are anxiety related. But Tourettic OCD is where the rituals are preceded by a physical urge, a sensation similar to how tics are. So there are a lot of different types of OCD. So not every, like, if we make recommendations in this about managing OCD in the workplace, it's not going to be a one size fits all, because OCD does affect everybody very differently.
Definitely. For me, the OCD that I experience the most are pure O, so primarily obsessional OCD. So it's mental, it's primarily mental, and I don't need to, quote unquote, have a routine or physically release that. But those obsessive thoughts can become very disturbing over time, depending on what they are. When you reach my age, you get used to it. It's kind of background noise. The only time where it kind of becomes disturbing is when an old one comes back or a new one comes in. So that always requires a little bit of adjustment. Otherwise, if you know what your PRO is about, then, it's very, very individual to handle. And the other OCD that I experience, I've got the checking OCD. It's ridiculous. It depends on the day, right? So some days I can set a schedule. I can go for weeks setting a schedule that I'm able to follow in the morning. It's like this, out the door at this time, back in, this is what we do. And then other times, I know what I have to do, but it's going to take me 45 minutes because I have to check and recheck. Although I know I've checked, like I'll go around with my phone to show myself that I've checked, but I still have to come back in. It is disabling in those cases. Yeah. So those are the two versions of OCD that I experience most.
Yes. For me, when I was younger, I had mostly Tourettic OCD. Which manifested as physical rituals, and they were very disabling. I basically lost the ability to do a lot of things because of that. And then when I was 17, it was, I don't know how to say it, scrupulosity / morality OCD. Probably said that first word completely wrong. It's a hard word to say.
Scrupulosity. Scrupulosity. Yeah.
Yeah, that. Elements of existential OCD, pure O as well. Yeah, but yes, OCD can come in many forms, and the sort of subset you have can also change sometimes. Beans.
Yeah. It's like Tourette, it's like ADHD, it's like migraines. You have a predisposition to it. Your brain is always Tourettic, always has ADHD, is always anxious, or OCD, but it might not manifest the same way all the time, right? So it's like if you have a predisposition for migraines, you know you've got a migraine brain, but it's not always debilitating and disabling. So it's the same with OCD, if that makes any sense for people who are new to the topic. Depending on what it is, depending on which version, again, there is no such thing as
beta.
One size fits all solutions.
I have
but there are some things that are fairly common. So when we're talking about OCD, a lot of times scheduling can be very difficult in a way that's we talked about ADHD earlier. It's not the same as ADHD. When I get into a checking cycle, there's nothing I can do. No amount of planning, no amount of scheduling, no amount of anything will change that. It's just going to take however long it's going to take for me to check. And that was a thing. So for me, when I was working in an office way back in the day, I knew I had flexible schedules. So I personally chose to be in the office by 7:30, 7:45 in the morning. But if I knew that I was entering a bad cycle of OCD, especially the checking kind before I went to work, I would either wake up earlier to get at work at 7:45, 8 o'clock in the morning at the latest, or I also knew that as long as I'm there by 9 a.m. and do my full 8 hours or 7.5 hours or whatever that was, it was okay, right? So I had that buffer, but I was also not. Oh, pardon me?
So I said contingency time.
Yeah, exactly. So I had that buffer. So everyone knew that I was going to show up early, but if I'm not early, I'm going to be quote unquote on time. But for me, being on time felt like being late, right? So, so to me, having that quote unquote flexible schedule of as long as I do my 7.5 hours throughout the day, I can start pretty much anytime I want. And yeah, as long as the customers are being looked after, right? So that was really the point.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of flexibility is needed when you have OCD because the rituals can take a lot of time and the specific plans you have for a day may not go to plan. Beans. So I definitely like that idea of starting later because a lot of people have rituals, like morning rituals. It can take a long time to get ready and get out the door. So definitely having that contingency sort of time, that buffer can be extremely helpful. And hopefully, you'll be able to get a flexible work schedule because that can be very helpful. Also, it's not just the morning rituals. It's if a person has rituals in the evening to so much of an extent that they can't even get to bed on time, then they may sleep less, and then they have to feel like they have to get up early to do the rituals, and then they get lack of sleep. So definitely starting later is just probably going to work a bit better. Beans.
So, for example, like my OCD, part of my OCD is getting up early. It's also it's kind of an obsession with accommodating myself, if that makes any sense. So I obsess about my own accommodation, about having my own space. So there's typically fewer people up before 7 a.m. So if I need to go outside with Maddie, if I need to go medicate, before 7 a.m., it's a pretty sure bet I'm not going to have to, quote unquote, socialize with people. So that is very much to accommodate myself because I kind of like having my own space in the morning. And I mean, like, I don't even want to talk about the weather I don't even want to do that. So yeah, so I try to avoid those times where people are awake.
Avoid human contact. In a workplace environment, if I take this, just singing a little song. In the workplace environment, a lot of people work in an office, and when they work in an office, they're usually on some sort of computer or laptop, or writing stuff down in a notebook. But a lot of people have sort of compulsions where they have to rewrite and reread things. And that can be very time consuming and frustrating to a person. Because reading,
especially, yeah, those business emails, countless times I would send out a business email. No matter how many times I would edit myself prior to sending, there would always be a panic after I sent it. Like, it's kind of inevitable. And I get that at pretty much every single email. It doesn't matter what I do. I feel like I have to edit myself.
Yeah.
After I've sent.
Those sort of rereading and rewriting compulsions can be pretty exhausting. So do you have any sort of idea of what accommodations could be given to a person who experiences that kind of compulsion?
Okay, there are a number of ways to accommodate. So first of all, flexible schedule, flexible deadlines is one thing.
Yes, definitely.
That's usually my first one. Flexible work arrangements. So whether you are able
flexibility is key.
work in an office or work from home, or a combination of the two. So having that flexibility as to where you can work from is another. When it comes to having to be in office and doing those things, share with your manager that your manager or your team leader or even a colleague, right? I mean, there's a lot of mentoring that takes place in the workplace and supports that take place in the workplace that are not necessarily from a manager, right? So you can ask for the accommodation of having someone check your emails before you send them out. So that is one accommodation. Granted, it might appear time-consuming on the surface, but from a productivity perspective, if I spend a half hour reading and rereading something that took me 3 minutes to write, and I spend 27 minutes to review it before I send it, and then I panic after sending it, I'm spending about 45 minutes on something that should take 3. So from a productivity perspective, it's not favorable. But if I ask a colleague to read my email, take that 1 minute to check that 3-minute email, and then I can send it off within 5 minutes, knowing that it's been vetted, checked, I can just clear that from my mind and just move on to the next thing. Having a partner in the office who can support that aspect of things, right? So it doesn't have to be just the one person, right? It could be more than one resource person. But that's one accommodation that I find, when I put it this way to employers, they really understand the value of 5 minutes versus 45.
It's strange because that's also the sort of thing that I would recommend. But when I read online about accommodations for OCD, they usually say that you should try not to have accommodations for it because it will just fuel the OCD. But in that situation, it's better to get the things done. And I think actually, I don't know, if you're constantly taking ages to do things, you're just going to get more and more frustrated and anxious about other people judging your productivity or whatever. So I'd say it's best to accommodate it. But for some reason, a lot of the articles I read say you shouldn't accommodate the OCD. Accommodations should only be temporary for OCD, otherwise you're going to fuel it. But the accommodations do help a lot.
They can be temporary because the manifestation of the expression of OCD will vary from time to time, right? So sometimes you will need the accommodation and others not so much. But yeah, like this idea that, oh, if you support it, you feed into it is not helpful in a workplace context where you have things to do. Yeah, it's important to keep that in mind, right? And it does have a compound effect on the person who doesn't feel like they can keep up and perform.
Self-esteem,
and it
affected.
Adds to the anxiety, right? Let's remember, vast majority of OCD are anxiety disorders, so we don't need to add to that anxiety, right? So, yeah.
And the thing is, like, if when I was younger, if I wasn't like accommodated, obviously I can't really give a workplace example because I didn't work when I was younger, I was a child. But when I was a child, my parents actually had to dress me, brush my teeth for me, they had to beans even carry me at times because my OCD was absolutely debilitating. A lot of people would say that is feeding the rituals, and the psychologist weren't happy with my parents for doing that.
No.
But the truth is, if I didn't have those accommodations, I wouldn't be able to do anything, and I probably wouldn't be able to even attend school, or I'd be even later than I was every day because I wouldn't be able to get myself dressed or anything unless I had like hours and hours and hours, which I didn't have. So sometimes the accommodations and adjustments are fully necessary. Beans.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned school because I'm trying to bring myself back to when that was a very long time ago. But I remember being in foster care, and the school was quite literally a 3-minute walk away from my home, and I would still manage to be late. I couldn't get up in the mornings because I couldn't fall asleep at night. Even I was suppressing a lot at that time. Like now going back, I was suppressing a lot of my neurological expressions back in those days. And yeah, like I couldn't get out the door on time. I couldn't fall asleep on time. None of those things. And that we just didn't talk about those things way back. So
yeah, that's again why flexibility is just so important, because well, obviously this isn't a work example, but that's because I wasn't working at this time. But maybe there's something similar in the workplace. I remember the school were quite irritated that I was always late, so they called my parents in and stuff and had a meeting. But thankfully, once they realized that I have OCD, they were pretty understanding. So I think that's why it can be helpful to tell an employer if you have OCD, like maybe after they hire you potentially.
Yeah, after.
Yeah.
That's one thing I keep telling people. There's no winning. If I disclose ahead, there's disadvantages. If I disclose afterwards, there's disadvantages. So it's tricky to navigate. Let's be really honest. I can be tricky to navigate. Instead of saying that you require accommodations for your OCD, ask about flex time. Yes. Depending on the work that you are applying for, ask if there's flex schedule. You obviously still have to have certain deliverables, but that's the first thing you can ask for, right? And nobody needs to know why.
Beans.
Many workplaces offer flexible work arrangements until you mention that you have a disability.
Oh, yeah.
That's very true. Like, there's flexible work arrangements for parents, for people who care about their parents. There's flexible work arrangements for all sorts of things. But as soon as you mentioned that you need flexible work arrangements to accommodate your disability, there seems to be something else at work. In Canada here, anyway, from my experience and the experiences of the people that I deal with on a regular basis.
So would you tell an employer that you had OCD?
First of all, you don't have to disclose any diagnosis whatsoever. I'm a person who's obviously open about my disabilities and my requirement for accommodations because, well, that's what I do for a living now. And in order to be able to do that for other people, I also have to do it for myself. And I have to say, it's a lot easier for me to advocate for other people than to advocate for myself. So for me, because I am so open about my conditions and because a lot of the jobs I apply for do require a person to be disabled, I just disclose that I identify as disabled, and the only accommodations I require for an interview is a voice interview, telephone interview, or Zoom voice interview. That's literally all I ask for in terms of accommodation. An employer in Canada, and I would reckon in many other places, aside from getting accommodated for the interview, they have no right to ask you if you need any kind of accommodation beyond that. So they for interviews, they have the right to ask you if you require accommodations for the interview, but until you have a job offer, until you've signed your job offer back and you are officially on the payroll, I'm sorry to say, I would withhold that information until it's absolutely necessary to disclose.
Yes. Do you think an employer may have negative judgments towards OCD if you said it before you were actually hired?
There still is a lot of stigma attached to OCD. Oh, you clean a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, you just have to have everything straight. That must be great. And things like that. Just for example, a friend of mine was familiar with the fact that I experience OCD. She had a friend of hers that was moving into a new home, and she'd never set up a kitchen of her own before. So she's like, oh, Christine can help you. And what I did not know was that Christine can help you. She's OCD. She'll have you organized in no time, is what she said.
Oh.
Yeah. So that really bothers me. So it can be disadvantageous because people will have a tendency to want to pigeonhole you. Yeah.
Stereotypical.
Yeah. So again, unless disability advocacy and inclusion is part of what you do for a living, focus on the accommodations you need, your communication requirement, your scheduling requirement, your environmental requirement. Because again, if your OCD is being averse to germs and watching for germs and everything, it would be very challenging to take public transportation, to go in an open office and all those things, right? So again, without disclosing that you might have germophobia OCD, you can say, do you have flexible work arrangements? Can I work from home most of the time, right? So you can accommodate yourself that way without necessarily disclosing.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you said about people thinking it's all neat and stuff, I think I actually once saw an article of why OCD was beneficial in the workplace, but it was all about like how it's organized and neat, and people in the OCD community, I think, were saying like that's actually not what it is. Because I feel like that could make an employer not take it seriously potentially, and I don't know, just not realize that it's actually something that does require a lot of support. It's not just being organized, it's a lot more than that. And sadly, I hate to say it, but the way OCD makes you organized isn't actually efficient because it takes a really long time. It kind of has the opposite effect.
I've seen individuals experiencing OCD with very messy houses. I can't get started because I'm imagining how it should look, and then I beat myself up because it doesn't look like that. And then the next thing I know, I've got a pile of stuff that I need to go through, which thankfully is fairly easy to go through once I get going. But the inability to start perfectly. So the inability to have a perfect start to a task will often prevent me from doing a task at all. It's just going to keep piling up. So that is like, it can be a very organized mess, but
organized chaos.
Yeah, exactly. Organized chaos. But yeah, it's not efficient, it's not productive, right? So there's nothing great about that. I'm just looking at the other things because I obviously pulled up, like the standard things, like everyone looks at it as a behavior. You can use an app, put headphones, like there's just the standard stuff that everyone talks about that really bothers me. They call it non-compliant behavior, OCD, which bothers me because it's not a non-compliance. It just makes it appear like it's motivated, and it's really not. Outside of that, I would, use the apps. So apps specific to anxiety and OCD, and using the tools that are already embedded in the workplace. That helps for planning, but there's nothing you can really do once that cycle kicks in unless you get the quote unquote reassurance. And again, you did raise a really good point that it seems like it's reinforcing OCD, but at the same time, you're helping a person. And, you know, over time, you might not need that support as much. The recommendations, a lot of times, they're trying to get you into social skills. And it's like, you know what? The vast majority of us are very familiar with the social aspect of the OCD, and everything you see is us masking. Yeah, I have issues when everyone wants to train you for social skills, when the reality of it is, more often than not, the person with OCD is accommodating everyone else's social normativity, if you will.
It's strange because ERP therapists, as you said, will say that you shouldn't like fuel the OCD, you shouldn't help the OCD and stuff, you shouldn't reassure, you shouldn't do this or that. But when you're going about your daily life, it's very difficult because sometimes if you don't get that extra accommodation, then you can't actually do things. That's the sad thing. Beans.
And then you get stuck, right? Again, like it's a cycle. You get stuck, and then the OCD gets worse, and it's really hard to get out of a cycle like that on your own. So yeah, so just having those supports there when you get into that mode. Again, reminding everyone that you might not need as much support all the time, and sometimes you might need more support than you need now. It's very much down to being able to communicate with your team lead, and your manager.
Yes.
Other than that, the tools, like some of the tools that are already in use within offices. So again, schedulers, most people have a computer station at work. Most of us have cell phones that we can set alarms to. So a lot of the tools to help with the quote unquote scheduling aspect are already there in the office. So there's no quote unquote additional cost to the employer most of the time when it comes to OCD accommodations.
I think that the thing is with OCD as well, it can take a lot of your focus, not in the same way as ADHD, but the intrusive thoughts can be kind of distracting. When they come into your head, you might for a little bit stop what you're doing. Also, the mental compulsions you have to focus on them a lot sometimes. Like sometimes they may be background sort of things. Sometimes you have to focus on them a lot. But some people's mental compulsions affect them so much and are so frequent that they can't focus on what's going on around them. And I can imagine that's very difficult in the workplace because I remember one time, obviously I wasn't in the workplace, but one time I was having so many mental compulsions and I was watching a film. The film was probably like 2 hours long or something like that. And I was only really aware of just a few minutes of it because the rest of the time I was doing mental compulsions. So that can be an issue in the workplace. The struggle of being unable to focus due to the constant mental compulsions.
And one of the things that I find also with those mental compulsions and intrusive thoughts and Puro, I also obsessed about finding the opposite of that, about finding why I got there. Like I get obsessed all sorts of ways around the obsessions, and it just doesn't stop. And as you say, you'll have something right in front of you for 2 hours, and you'll only catch a few seconds of it just because you are so occupied trying to monitor what's going on. Is this something I'm going to need to act out? Is this something that will very real human emotions attached to it that go beyond the neurology? Because I do have emotional responses to some of my tics sometimes.
What would you say to someone in the workplace who has those sort of intrusive thoughts and mental compulsions that take a lot of their focus?
Oof.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge. Beans.
I grew up without knowing what those intrusions were. So I thought I was evil. I thought I was a bad person. I thought I was all sorts of things, right? So I did not know what it was. And even in my 40s, once I started discovering what Tourette syndrome was, I still was not comfortable to talk about my intrusive thoughts because I thought, well, somebody's going to commit me. Someone's going to put me in jail. Like there's something wrong with me. So first of all, I'm sorry you're going through this. There's nothing wrong with you, because chances are, if you feel bad about some of your thoughts, that means that your moral compass is very okay, right? You're still a real person. You're still a good person. You're still a person who's growing and getting to know yourself. So first of all, I'm very sorry you're going through that. So whatever your OCD says, you are a good person. So let's start with that. Get familiar with the kind of intrusive thoughts that you experience. If you have access to counseling, I strongly recommend that you go that route. Fellow humans who experience OCD as well are also the best people to ask about those things. So what worked for me, and I know it's not going to work for everyone, once I understood what it was, once I understood I was not going to get arrested for saying, hey, this is happening in my head, I know it's not going to be something I'm going to do. So you can do the self-reassurance, which takes practice, granted. So for me, as I said, I'm at the point where I went so many years managing without knowing I was managing. So as soon as I realized it was just something in my head, it was not something I was ever going to do, but still there's always a fear that I'm going to do something bad. Once I understood that, it kind of became something in the background. That's always happening in the background. And as you mentioned, something new happens that might take all the attention, a little bit of adjustments, and then it goes to the back with the rest, with the cacophony that goes on in the back of my head. The cacophony that goes in the back of my head all the time. So it joins that general white noise in the back. For example, trigger warning.
Trigger warning!
So
I was going to make a lovely announcement.
It's not a workplace thing, but it might become a workplace thing for some people. Trigger warning. Puro regarding knives. I love cooking. I love preparing food. I love good food. I love great food. I love food the way I want it done. But I'm having a really hard time around knives right now. And it's very difficult for me, and it's entirely mental, right? I've never done anything like that with a knife, but it's entirely mental. So I have to choose. Do I spend 2 hours preparing a meal that I'm not going to enjoy consuming because I'll be so exhausted from the mental exhaustion of fighting those thoughts that I have in my head while preparing the food with a knife? So I've been buying pre-cut foods, etc., etc. So
yeah, tampon. Hello.
So if you're working in a kitchen and you've got this kind of OCD, maybe you probably should not be working in a kitchen. Yes. If it's going to be that disturbing, if it's going to take away so much from your workday, from what you're doing, maybe, I'm sorry to say, maybe you might want to consider something else, right? As I said, it breaks my heart that it takes everything I have to prepare a meal that I really enjoy. So yeah, it's been a long time since I've used a knife in my own kitchen. Yep.
It does sound really hard for you, and I'm sorry to hear that you are going through that. And beans. And I'm also really sorry to hear that you thought you were a bad person for a really long time. That's why OCD awareness is really important. Yeah, and nobody should feel ashamed of their intrusive thoughts, but obviously that's a big part of OCD, like feeling shame about it. But yeah, that's really interesting that you say like certain things won't be the right job for you, because there definitely are some triggers which can make it worse. And if you are constantly in a state of anxiety and fear, then that can't be good for you. You know, that's draining you all the time, and you don't deserve to be feeling that way. The interesting thing is, again, a lot of like ERP therapists will say don't avoid your triggers, work through it. But the problem is it takes a lot from a person. And the problem is as well, anxiety can affect your physical health, and that's a really horrible thing. And if you keep putting yourself through that, I feel like you're just going to keep draining yourself.
Yeah, it's exhausting. It's really exhausting. And one thing that people need to understand, as you say, ERP therapists need to understand, exposure therapy should be done on your own time, not at work.
Yes.
I mean, you're always, your body health, your mental health, your neurological health are always with you, fair enough. But yeah, a work environment where, quote unquote, you are expected to be productive, you are expecting to have a certain return on their investment. That's not, I'm sorry to say, but that's not the place to do exposure therapy. That's where you get accommodated. Focus on getting accommodated so you can get your work done. So start with that.
I definitely agree with that. Beans.
Yeah. So yeah, if you're going to, quote unquote, work on things that you've learned, make sure you've learned them well outside of the work environment before. Like you're still a person at work. Fair. Like I want people to understand that you are still a person at work. You're still allowed to be a human. You're still allowed to experience all those things. It's just in the long term, is that viable? So
I do want to say that I think it's okay if you're able to have a sick day or a holiday day off for your mental health, because if your OCD is like going through a really, really bad phase, can you actually deal with doing the work? Can you actually do the work? That's kind of the problem, because sometimes it just takes up so much of your focus. So I'll say that it's actually okay to take a day off if you can, like if you have enough sick pay, if you have enough holiday pay, to let yourself rest and let yourself sort of get a little bit better, because it's not going to help to be at work when you're already going through so much. That adds to the stress of it. OCD, I think, can get worse with stress, and also generally anxiety. So be gentle with yourself, look after yourself, because it is exhausting. And Beans, you don't need to feel ashamed of like saying you need some time off for it. Mental health days are important.
They are. But also, if you need to take a day off from your work, again, the $1 million question.
Are you being accommodated?
You being accommodated.
Yes.
So if you need that much time off from your work, do you have the proper supports to do that work? That's a good question. So again, that's where flex time, flexible schedules can come in very, very handy, right? You really should not need to take a day off your work just because you're not being accommodated. Yes. You should not be penalized for requiring accommodations and not getting them. So that's when that happens too often. We all need a day off, granted, right? But if it becomes the solution, you need to reconsider how you are being accommodated and how you are able to work. Yeah.
Make the work environment easier for you, and advocate for yourself to try and get those accommodations so that you don't have to go through that. You don't have to constantly avoid it. Beans.
Right. But yes, once you're hired, most people are very understanding when you say you have certain communication needs. So it's a good thing that people are more receptive to it when you put it that way, right? In a prior video, we talked about ADHD, how it's more, quote unquote, socially acceptable to experience ADHD, ADD. OCD is not quite there yet, but getting there. The more we talk about it, the more we have those conversations, the better it's going to be.
There is a huge lack of understanding about OCD, because again, the stereotype, that thing that it's just being me, people don't realize how much it can actually affect someone. I remember in my old psychology class, we actually learned about how OCD was once listed as one of the most disabling conditions by, I think it was the World Health Organization, and people in my class were really surprised. They were like, wait, what? I thought it wasn't something affecting people that much. And then I'm there like, because I have OCD, I'm like, no, it does.
Yeah, it's not cute, it's not quirky, it's debilitating. When it gets a hold of you, it can, yeah, that's interesting.
It's not just a personality trait.
No. I mean, but there's a difference between the two, right? Like there's obsessive personality traits, obsessive personalities, and then there's OCD, and there's all those different things, all those different labelings that are somewhat related, but not really, but sort of. So it's just having more of those conversations like we are now, making those conversations available to whoever wants to witness them is important, because I hope, well, obviously my hope is that whatever we talk about is useful to our fellow humans experiencing OCD.
OCD links.
That works.
OCD links.
It's perfect. Make new words. I mean, that's what a brilliant brain does. So yeah, so having those conversations, making those conversations available. I'm sure we talk about a lot of things that people are afraid to bring up in the workplace. So I hope it helps demystify some of it.
Yes, and I do want to say though, if you feel like you really can't work because your condition is just too severe, maybe you have loads of co-occurring issues, then it's okay to be on disability benefits. And I say that because I know some people with like OCD and mental health conditions who originally thought that they wouldn't qualify. They knew they struggled to work, but they kind of was like, I shouldn't be on benefits for it. But actually, sometimes you need that. Sometimes it is very severe. It's a very severe condition, and the co-occurring issues as well. If you have OCD plus a bunch of other stuff, it can be very difficult.
Yeah, we usually talk about this at the top, but we can say this at the end. Your ability to work does not determine your worth as a human being. It's as simple as that. Easier said than done. I'm working on that myself because I'm not always able to work full time. So thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, a person's ability to work does not define their worth at all. At all.
And when you are in the workplace, it's definitely important to advocate for yourself in any way that you can and ask for help. And again, flexibility, that's a big thing. Do you think asking for extra time on like projects, having deadline extensions could be something that people could ask for if they know that everything's taking them so much longer?
So if you know how long things take you, take that into consideration when you are part of a team, when it comes to deliverables. So don't take on a new project until you know for sure that you finished this one project, especially if you know that you've got a hard time getting started. That's one of the things that I hear often with OCD, and more often than executive dysfunction, sure enough, is the difficulty to get things started. So yeah, make sure you complete, make sure that your team lead and your manager know that you need to complete your task before you start a new one, and be very, very clear as to what the expectations are.
Do you think it's helpful for people to try and work harder and like putting more effort when their OCD is milder and not flaring so that they have that stuff done, or will that just worsen the OCD and cause it to get worse? Beans.
Well, as a person who experiences neurodivergences to different degrees every day, anytime I'm functional, I use it.
Same.
Yeah, every time I've got any kind of function, let's clean that fridge, let's write, let's read, let's do this. So yeah, anytime I'm able, I want to do stuff. So yes, I will, and I will be very effective at it. Of course, if you have other neurodivergences, you can capitalize on those as well. So it can work really well together once you know yourself and how you manage yourself. So yeah, if you're a person that's up for it, that wants to get things done, so when the neurological expression is milder and not as disabling, most of us really enjoy it and take that opportunity to do stuff.
I do that a lot, and it's definitely helped me learn how to make the most of things. So I think that's a positive. I think that it's definitely kind of helpful when your condition's milder, you're like, let's get this stuff done, and I try and make the most of the good times so that when it comes back, I already have the stuff done. Sorry.
No, that's good. So with me, when I'm quote unquote disabled, I think of the things I'd rather be doing. So
Yeah.
by the time I'm okay, usually I have a list like this long of things I want to do, and I get stuck in a loop of which one do I start or which one do I keep going. So again, it has advantages, disadvantages, but my ADD, ADHD, and anxiety in general make me quite the planner. So I've got like, it's like, okay, priority here, priority here, priority here, must get done. So yes, I usually look at what's needed most for the big picture right now.
To people who often have like sudden flares of OCD, sudden onset flares of OCD, which is very common in people with PANDAS and PANDAS, I would say it's okay to like temporarily get signed off work if you need to, because when it suddenly explodes, your brain just doesn't seem to function. So I would say that might be an option for some people, because I do know that when my OCD was very, very bad, it wasn't just the OCD, I had like a bunch of other stuff, but it was the OCD that I think presented first. We knew that, when I say we, I mean me and my parents, that I couldn't attend college in that state. And my assignments, I had to ask, I had like a ridiculous amount of assignments due, like 5, and I had to get extensions that are a few weeks long on them, because I couldn't even write a sentence. Like trying to type a sentence, my brain was just too filled to do anything. So if it gets to that point where you can't even like write or make it into a place, then it's okay to just get signed off for a bit, look after yourself, and when you're better, then return. Beans.
Yeah. The equivalent of a sick day, but a sick week.
Yeah. Sometimes it's needed. Beans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no sense in trying to work through something like that, right? It's kind of like trying to work through a shutdown or rage attack.
That's everything's gonna get smashed.
Yeah, pretty much. It's nearly impossible to be productive under those conditions. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the things, you know, just the high level general idea behind it. I think we've covered a lot of ground here though.
Beans. Oh, there is actually, I think there is like a little bit I wanted to add, just like sandwich, not sandwich.
That'd be good right now though.
Yes. There are certain traits that can be accommodated quite well. So if your OCD makes it difficult to read, then potentially an audiobook could work. I don't, well,
oh, yeah.
Do you have books?
Screen readers, audiobooks, voice to text, because it can be
yes.
Yeah, I know when I write, I get so very picky. So voice to text does that for you. And then you get to edit anyway, right? So you get to get that edit out of the way as well. So anything else that you can think of that could be helpful?
Tampons.
For some of us, yeah.
Well, some people have compulsions where it's quite difficult to use technology. I know when I was younger, I just scroll up and down on the computer. I'm like, this takes ages just scrolling. I don't know if this is fully possible, but getting your work printed out, I don't know. That's really difficult, like if you're filling out a spreadsheet or something. But maybe if you're going through a bad phase, getting stuff printed out, doing it on a sheet, and then when your brain is functioning a little better, go back to it and just copy what you did on the sheet onto the thing. Maybe that would work. Beans.
Whatever works for a person, right? Like for me, sometimes it's easier to use a pen and a paper, even if the writing is messy. I get the message across, and I know I'm going to edit and re-edit regardless, right? So sometimes I just need to write. Sometimes it's voice to text, and sometimes it's just type on the computer. And I find, I don't know why, I don't know if anyone else experiences this, but I find on the computer, perhaps it's just the ability to edit and re-edit and such. On the computer, like I can take something that should take 2.5 minutes and turn it into a 1.5 hour exercise, and that's all good. Again, a lot of the quote unquote authorities on accommodations suggest a lot of the same, right? Job coaches, skills, social skills, and hearing that a lot, can make one very averse to asking for accommodations, because I mean, I don't like the idea of being told that I'm lacking in social skills. My social skills are what they are. I'm very aware of what's going on, and it's not behavior. And it's like, why am I going for behavior modifying techniques for something I can't help? There's still the one size fits all approach to things. And as you say, some of the advice can be useful. It's good guidelines, good places to start for most of them. I have to give credit where credit is due. Some of those are fairly well thought and do offer more than you need, so you can navigate a little better. But I find many of the accommodations are there of still very, very ableist, still very based on the medical model of disability and not the social model of disability. So it's still very medicalized. And it's still pathologized. And yeah, that doesn't help with the stigma. That does not help with self-esteem. Like it can be very difficult on self-esteem, knowing that, oh, if I speak about OCD, oh, they're gonna put me in a social skills class. And I know some people that asked for accommodations, and it had nothing to do with social skills. They just literally needed someone to read their email, like the accommodation I suggested earlier. And they were sent to a social skill something, which, why? More often than not, unfortunately, we're still, disability accommodation difference is still perceived as something that we have to carefully check the boxes of. It's still liability. It's still, yeah. So they just really need to show that we've tried everything. Yeah.
Also, this kind of isn't fully related to OCD, but I guess kind of is. I went to a social skills class thing at school, and it was not helpful, and if I'm being completely honest, because it was like, what I had to fill in this thing. It's like, what other people do that annoy me and what I do that annoys others. Didn't help my self-esteem, because what I do that annoys others were just my tics and OCD rituals. And then it's like, how do you change that? I can't. That didn't help.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, nobody can say that, like, it's a self-conscious, it's a self-esteem issue. It's got nothing to do with behavior. Yeah. So yeah, it's still very based on neurotypical expectations. So yeah, but we're changing that a few conversations at a time, right? So I hope.
Yeah. I think that we have covered quite a lot now. So I think, like, the biggest point I got from this is, like, flexibility is key, and beans, wank stains, and
Hopster,
that you need to do what you can do to get through the work and get your work done, because if you try and, like, fight it all the time, fight your compulsions, then you might not be able to get stuff done. Beans.
Right. So yeah, at work, focus on the accommodation, and if there's anything that you feel you can work through with ERP, then do that on your own time. At work, ask for the support. You're not feeding anything, you're getting the support you need to get the job done. That's it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Christine, for coming back. It's a comeback. Woo! It's always really lovely to hear what you have to say. It's really lovely when you share your expertise and experiences. And it's been lovely to have this conversation with you.
Always my pleasure and privilege. Thank you, Romy.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to everybody watching. Hopefully this can be helpful, and hopefully it's interesting as well.